Said sleep isn't passive, but an active skill. And from a behavioral psychology perspective, what does the latest research really tell us about how we can actively influence our sleep?
What is the recommended protocol from sleep professionals? So, the recommended protocol, if you are struggling with your sleep, is currently what is known as the gold standard, which is CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And it has very high efficacy as far as its effectiveness for many individuals struggling with their sleep. And part of what's really noteworthy about that is that so much of it now, of course, there is a strategy. There's things that you're going to change around your scheduling of your sleep. This is where this whole stimulus control idea comes in.
Be minimally processed. Molly, let's start with that moment in Rome at the Colosseum when you had a panic attack after days without sleep.
Yes.
Can you take us back to that turning point? What was going through your mind in that very moment?
Oh, man. What was going through my mind was just shame and embarrassment and fear and panic and terror and just a bunch of emotions that were really fueled. And it was one of the real rock bottom moments in my life. And to even further paint the picture, my aunt and uncle had flown out to meet my husband and I because it was supposed to be this great entrepreneurial journey, kind of a la Tim Ferriss energy, if anyone's familiar with his work of, put everything in storage and get a one-way ticket and travel the world. But the thing that didn't work was that I didn't quite realize at the time that my nervous system was fried. And as a serial entrepreneur, my husband and I, we had both, had different businesses in New York City, burning the candle at both ends, stressed to the max. And then once we landed in at first Madrid, then Barcelona, then Croatia, Budapest, then finally in Italy. That was kind of just the straw that broke the camel's back because at this point I now had not been sleeping consecutively and for a long stretch of time. And I will say at different points, and when it got to different, just a lack of workability, I went to the doctors and was given lots of different types of sleeping pills. Now I share about that from a perspective of that's part of why I have this fuel and fire to get this information out from a systemic problem. I'm clear that doctors would love to be able to help support people when they're struggling with their sleep. And to be able to spot when sleep might be part of the problem and root cause of some of the things that people are dealing with downstream. But unfortunately, because at least in the United States, the average doctor is getting around 2 hours of training in sleep, even at a Harvard Med. We've got a breakdown in how this whole game is designed. And so right now, currently, it behooves us to learn about this ourselves and advocate for ourselves. But at the time, I was none the wiser about all these things. And so I'm getting different sleeping pills from different doctors. There's no plan in action. There's no sense of like, oh, well, we'll do X, Y, and Z, and then things will be alleviated. Instead, it was a fear that am I stuck like this? And I come from a family with a lot of mental health issues. And so there's a fear for me of like, oh no, is this the moment that I'm going to be dealing with a whole lifetime of being medicated to do something even so basic, you would think, as to sleep each night? So a lot of thoughts are going through my head, and then just shame and embarrassment that we had my aunt and uncle scheduled to come meet us on this world tour. And then, when they showed up, I was just a wreck. I hadn't been sleeping. I was stressed out and all these things. And, I can kind of like laugh and be light about it now. But at the time, it was a very scary period. And so for anyone that might be dealing with some form of insomnia, difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, you might be familiar with some of the fears that might come up. But even if you're listening and you're like, well, I'm not dealing with that, don't worry. We can still support and just even generalized support and up leveling for your sleep and wherever you might be at.
Yeah. So were you struggling with insomnia or difficulty staying asleep?
So before we started traveling, in retrospect, I now know that I was dealing with major, kind of circadian disruption, anxiety, all kinds of things, but I didn't qualify it or quantify it as anything dealing with insomnia. I was an entrepreneur, so I could just make my own hours. So I would say, oh, I'm going to bed so late, so I just sleep in later. What's the problem? And so now I'm kind of acting like a shift worker. I work with a ton of high stakes poker players, so I was kind of on this poker player schedule, going to bed super late, waking up super late, but justified and righteous about it the whole time, and not seeing the lack of workability in that, and then lots of variability in my sleep wake schedule. But it wasn't until we landed in Madrid with I grew up with not a lot of money, and so I never really traveled much and never experienced jet lag. And so at first I chalked it up to jet lag, but then and also in hindsight, there was a lot of things I could have done to better support getting back on track, but I kept doing the wrong things. And this is why I say sleep is a skill, because many of us just are so divorced from the things that could support our sleep, and throw in modern advancements like travel and things that are just not exactly part of our normal evolutionary biology. Then you need some of these this education in your back pocket, and I didn't have that. So I did a lot of things not to do, and then it just kept spiraling. And I do remember vividly times of going down different forum rabbit holes. Now, this was almost over a decade ago. And so some of these forums would be really not recommended places to go hang out if you're stressing out. Because then it would talk about, sleep anxiety and people that have now been on hardcore benzodiazepines, Z drugs, et cetera, for decades and decades. And you were met with some of these stories that would be very fear invoking, that you're stuck this way. And so, really, what I wanted was to be able to have more examples of people that had been through what I'd been through, but and made it to the other side. And I was struggling to find some of those examples. So, that's part of why I want to share about like my experience, others, other clients that we work with, that bringing the knowledge and the hope and the possibility, and the conviction that yes, if even if you're struggling right now, that this too shall pass, and that,
Yeah.
dare I say, there's an opportunity for this to become a true blessing in your life. Now, if you would have got into time machine and told me that then, I would have like, no. But now retroactively, and now that I see you back, it became one of the most important things that happened to me, because then it was so uncomfortable. And often in behavioral change, you don't have to get uncomfortable, but it does help to make
Yeah.
behavioral shifts when you are just fed up or you cannot go further in how things have been managed. And that's kind of what happened for me and a lot of people that deal with sleep issues.
Yeah, I think for anyone, who got to a point where they actually achieved something or they unlocked that, that potential, they had to go through some sort of a breakdown to go through that breakthrough. And I'm sure that experience is what, got you to launch sleep. Sleep is a skill, which challenges how most of us think about sleep. So before we dive into the science of it, tell us what that phrase means to you. Like, your background in behavioral psychology at the nonverbal group gives you that unique lens on sleep, obviously. But let's establish that scientific foundation for our listeners. You've said sleep isn't passive, but an active skill. And from a behavioral psychology perspective, what does the latest research really tell us about how we can actively influence our sleep?
Yeah, so good. So one, I would say, let's look at what is the recommended protocol from sleep professionals. So the recommended protocol, if you are struggling with your sleep, is currently what is known as the gold standard, which is CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and it has very high efficacy as far as its effectiveness for many individuals struggling with their sleep. And part of what's really noteworthy about that is that so much of it now, of course, there is a strategy. There's things that you're going to change around your scheduling of your sleep. This is where this whole stimulus control idea comes in. So that your bed is just for sleep and sex, the idea that sleep hygiene, so certain things that you do leading up to bed, certain things that you do while you're like within your bedroom, certain things that you do when you wake up. All of these things, those are kind of behavioral, environmental, but there's a lot that goes into, as it were, the acronym standing for cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia specifically. That's where the I part comes in. And so the cognitive part is so crucial of the reframing of how we're thinking about our sleep. So the aspect of the belief structure being so important, I think is quite noteworthy. Because so for someone like me, and I think potentially a lot of people, you might be inclined to, if you're struggling with your sleep, to go for maybe a quick fix. So that's what I did. Give me the pill, give me the supplement, give me the protocol, give me the stack, blah, blah, blah. And it's not to say that there's not maybe a time and a place for some of these things. And depending on what people are dealing with, not to say that there aren't some that could just be so helpful and supportive. And if you don't believe that you can sleep well, good luck. It's kind of one of those things that we see even for across the board for any type of endeavor going into a skill set, that the context is decisive, and the
Hmm.
context gives us our results. And that absolutely is part of what we see with sleep. And certainly there appears to be a bit of a type of person that is more sensitive or have more of a proclivity for dealing with insomnia. And I meet those characteristics, which tend to be kind of overthinkers, type A, anxious, blah, blah, blah,
Yes, yes,
all these
same.
things, right? Okay, see? So, and it's like, when that type of set of habits or ingrained patterns start to deal with a tipping point of stress and emotional volatility, then you pair that with a time of sleep, which really, in essence, is about letting go and about being at ease and trusting the process. When life isn't really working, that personality might butt up against kind of be a Chinese finger trap, where you'd force it and you're trying to force it so much that you actually get more and more stuck. And so ironically, it's the learning to kind of let go that allows that Chinese finger trap to release. Now, that's the psychological aspect, and there's lots of research to support this. If anyone wants to go and explore kind of PubMed, sleep, cognitive behavioral therapy, and if they want to look at some others approaches that I actually really like, a nice hybrid or Venn diagram or blend of, is ACTI or ACT, so acceptance commitment therapy for insomnia. And that further brings in more of that mindset approach, and it's kind of practicing and learning to practice acceptance of this time in our life where we might be struggling with our sleep, and rolling with that, which for those of us who are used to like forcing outcomes and being high achievers and making things work, this can be
Yeah.
one of the biggest things for us to learn in our lives. So hopefully that answers some of the question, at least from the behavioral and psychological standpoint. And what I would say is that how at sleep is a skill, and you kind of asked about, like, what does that mean? That sleep is a skill for me
Yeah.
is the marriage of how things were in, if we look back ancestrally into how we used to live for thousands of years, and that kind of encoded DNA that we
Hmm.
still are, walking around with, but we've become so disconnected from. It's pulling from that. Now, what does that look like? That looks like chronobiology, the science of time and how time affects your biology. That looks like circadian rhythm entrainment, so training and strengthening your circadian rhythm. And it looks like pulling from wisdom of quantum biology, which also is pulling from aspects of, before we hit record, and mitochondrial health, and other ways from a very, very small, quantum level, and how these things can all support your sleep. So it does get quite layered, and this is where the skill set piece comes in. But at its most simple, if you were to live how we used to live, and I know not everyone's going to be running to go live in a tent or something, but right, just for a mental exercise, if we were to live in fully in the rhythms of nature outside, so much of this would be handled. Why? Because a couple things would happen. One of the strongest zeitgebers or time givers for your circadian rhythm is your light dark kind of balance and ratio. And we do have research even out of University of Colorado that took night owls camping. And when they took them camping, the first study was for a long week, and the second study was for a long weekend. And throughout the period of that, those night owls were able to move their melatonin production and surge in measurable melatonin much, much earlier, just by virtue of removing all electric lights at night, being exposed to bright light by day, And then, being out in the elements too. You can make the argument for the temperature being another Zeitgeber or circadian cue. So a lot of that would get handled, and that would also impact your psychology because so much of what we're dealing with. And this is where you go down the rabbit hole. This is like becomes a much longer conversation. But then what is fascinating, this changed my whole life, was this understanding of how our environment impacts our psychology and biology. So much so that that's actually part of the reason that I moved from the Northeast over, in the United States, from New York City down to Austin, Texas, because when you're in lower latitude locations closer to the equator, you have more opportunity for sunlight and you have more opportunity for a lifestyle that has you outdoors more routinely. And as a result, this drastically impacts your experience of life. So your neurotransmitters get impacted, your serotonin level, your vitamin D opportunity. There's an entire stretch of opportunity of vitamin D where you're just devoid, that you cannot get it, access to it in these northern latitude locations. So I would love for people to be informed on their geography, and how much of that is impacting their physiology, psychology, and of course their sleep. So this gets into a layered piece, but you can look at this even from a really great example is MS rates. And if you look at MS rates, right, and the more north you are, or I should say, the more you get remove yourself from the equator, the higher of the prevalence of MS rates, and those are it's a mitochondrial based disease. And so what we know is that light, dark, getting brighter days, darker nights is going to massively support your results with your sleep. And that's always our first place to begin. Now, if people get nothing else out of what I'm talking about, then let it be this, that you start your day with bright light and you end your day with absolute darkness, total darkness in your bedroom, that you cannot see the hand in front of your face. But then in the hours leading up to bed, that you are ideally, and you can measure this. An app I love is called the My Circadian app, but there's other ones. And then you can measure the lux in your environment. So I'd love for you to aim to be getting to less than around 20 lux, at least leading up to bed. And then even in, about the hour before bed, ideally around a less than 10 lux, closer to candlelight. Candles can usually be around like 7 lux or so. And so you're looking to achieve that and that balance, really going on a tirade of getting rid of all of your normal lights that we've always thought of as like banal and basic and not a problem. Turns out those are really impacting our melatonin production. And this is not like being bombastic. This is measurable as far as your results with your sleep. So making sure you're doing that, but also getting that bright light exposure, not from behind a window. So I have these windows. Oh, can you see the windows back here? And so if I was to just only be inside behind those windows, then I would still be getting insufficient light because of the way that that gets filtered out, and it's adulterated light. So you're not getting the full spectrum light. So we want you to, in the mornings, be ideally exposed to sunrise, UVA rise, and UVB rise. And I shouldn't say just UVB rise, but at least UVB dripping throughout the course of the day. And then ideally, so prioritize that. But then ideally, you're switching over into the evening to then being exposed to this UVA dip, and then to sunset light, which is also filled with that infrared pink light. You see so many kind of biohackers or what have you with all the red light panels, which, not to knock those can be great. And you can get those for free by being out in the sun on those, especially the first bands of the day and the end of the day. So during that sunrise, UVA, and the flip side, going into sunset. So this might sound, if someone's listening like, ugh, what is all this light talk? I'm spending this time because it makes such a difference for so many aspects of your health and well-being. And this really goes into things even like your glucose regulation, your metabolism, visceral fat, your ability to build muscle, your hormonal balance. I mean, just the list is endless.
It's awesome because for me, West Coast is like that. Whenever I'm on the West Coast, when I'm outdoors, because obviously, like I shared with you before we started the episode, when we visit West Coast, specifically Seattle, I spend majority of my time outdoors, and I notice that when I'm there, I eat better, I sleep better, my mood is a lot better. It's crazy how much it just affects my overall life and helps me just feel better overall. And I know you touched a little bit on circadian rhythm, and there's so much confusion out there about what actually works and what doesn't. So let's play Mythbusters. So there's so many sleep myths that not only don't help but can actually harm our sleep, right? So I think one myth that really caught my attention, in our modern day, and I saw this in my research too, that you can train your body to need sleep less. And I think so many entrepreneurs and high performers wear the 4-hour sleep schedules like a badge of honor. And it's it kind of really influences the general population that it's okay to sleep less and be high performing. So what does science actually say about this?
Such a great question. So, if someone might be listening and dealing with insomnia, often they desperately want to get more than 4 hours. And I have been there too. And so, they can get right, because you want to get that sleep, and the struggle can be, okay, well, I'm dealing with this. I want to do anything possible, and yet it's almost like this paradoxical result occurs where the more pressure we put onto ourselves is like performance anxiety, and now, right now, we're struggling even more, and then we start hearing all over how bad it is for you to not sleep, so then we're even more freaked out, and so right? Exactly. So I'll try to be thoughtful for anyone that is dealing with that, and I appreciate you sharing too, because listen, I have clearly been there. Now I want to underscore, if anyone is there, and happy to discuss more with you too, that this too shall pass, that the body wants homeostasis. It wants to get all the sleep that it needs. It is pulling for that, and we can help support it to get that back on track. And it often just takes some of this education, stepping back, getting ourselves aligned with some of these things that can really make the difference versus just, I don't know, sleepy girl mocktail TikTok trend or whatever, you know what I mean? Not to knock it, but half the time some of these things might be floating around, but aren't going to really be the needle mover. So to answer your question, what I'd say is, if someone's listening and they really want to get more than 4 hours, I would ironically offer for them this kind of permission slip to let yourself understand that right now you're struggling with your sleep, and that with the trust and knowledge that this is not permanent, that can help create a future to live into, so that you're not freaking yourself out about it. I know it's easier said than done. And then it's like, well, but I got a lot of stuff to do and I've got things on my calendar. And like, what are you talking about? Like, I need the answer. But at least right now, while our nervous system is all riled up, just from a framework perspective, helping to give ourselves that peace and knowing that this too shall pass, there's a gift here. Now, at the same time, for the other group that maybe they are dealing with maybe like revenge bedtime procrastination, if anyone's heard of that kind of terminology, where they are staying up later to try to carve out time for themselves, or they're just, sleep hasn't really been a priority, or they're kind of like a la taking maybe Elon Musk advice or whatever, like, and saying, well, if I want to be a high performer, hustle and grind culture and da-da-da, and go to bed late, wake up early. For that group, then we do want to educate and say, listen, if productivity, for one thing, is your, number one modus operandi, or, well, how to say it, your number one goal, then what I would say is that sleep is your hidden gateway through that. And so, what do I mean by that? Is that if we are to be hitting at our individual sleep need, and now for the average adult, that's between 7 to 9 hours, average healthy adult. Now, as you get older, past, say, as we get in different ranges point to different ages, but past, say, 55, 60, etc., then we might see a little bit of a change in that. And then before adulthood, teenage years, then you have a different sleep need quite often. But for the average healthy adult, 7 to 9 hours. Now that's a U-shaped curve, so there's some people that can thrive and do well with a little bit less, and there's some people that can thrive and do well with a little bit more. But for the most part, that all falls within that range. And we do have a lot of evidence to support that, especially when you go less than about 6 hours of night, then like we have many meta-analyses and other things that show deleterious effects to your health. So cardiovascular health, stroke, diabetes, cognitive decline, and death from any cause go all up, aka all cause mortality. So there's a lot of things that go up when you start going below that 6 hours a night. Now, from a productivity perspective, our ability to emotionally regulate gets impaired. Our ability to, just kind of read other people, read faces. My husband's a body language expert, background in forensics. So he layers like facial coding all over people's faces. And so, just gets really nerdy in that world. But the ability to discern what another person's intent might be is thrown off just by virtue of not sleeping well. So there's lots of things that you might not expect that go awry. Also, though, if we're talking about men, a great thing to share with them is that your testosterone rate is going to plummet. So your testosterone is going to really, really suffer. And as many will point to that it often doesn't return until your sleep sufficiently returns, and you can reach what the U.S. Army is calling a point of no return, where eventually, if you keep this up, then you can't really get yourself back to your levels of testosterone that might have been available before, is what they postulate. But that's for men. And then for women, kind of hormonal problems
Yeah.
emerge, so that can be quite a struggle. And then, of course, from a bidirectional, just like almost cosmic joke,
Yes.
that as we navigate
Yeah.
perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, that then it's kind of a chicken or the egg. Like then our hormones start to go awry, and then that can impact our sleep, and then the sleep
Mm.
impacts hormones. Which one came first? We don't know, but they're all a slew there. So I share all that that's for the group that just maybe hasn't prioritized this and has been, white knuckling
Yeah.
their sleep, and kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The knowledge there for that group can be really important, and then they can be life changing. That's where for that group, wearables can often be wonderful when they start to kind of gamify, and now they have stats and figures and numbers that they can start to shift their behavior around. Whereas for the insomniac group, sometimes it can make sense to abstain from tracking for a while, but I will say it's not for everyone that it needs to go like that. So what I will point to is there are some people struggling with their sleep that ironically, when they start tracking, they're actually relieved because they see something known as paradoxical insomnia, which is very common, where you are actually sleeping more than you might think. And so now that doesn't mean that it's not to gaslight and say, well, you're sleeping fine, even though you felt like you're awake the entire night. Obviously, something's not working, but it can provide a breath of fresh air. And I hope for anyone listening, knowing that you very well might be dealing with some form of paradoxical insomnia if you're struggling with your sleep, just to give yourself like, ooh, okay, even though it felt like I barely got anything last night, that what's likely is that my body is very intelligent and has been able to get some micro sleeps in there and kind of time dilation shifts. And that's not to put a cap on what's possible. Obviously, if you're experiencing that, something's going on with nervous system regulation and other issues. So we want to get to the source of that. But hopefully, just to get you through the day, it can help you know that you probably got more sleep than you realize. And sometimes wearables can help reinforce that. And you'd be like, oh, okay, I did get 5.5 hours. I can do this. Like, something along those lines.
Yeah, and I also heard about another phenomenon called orthosomnia, where people are becoming obsessed with perfect sleep scores because these tracking technologies are also they're helping, but they're also causing anxiety in those who want those perfect numbers. Yeah. Another misconception and a myth that I want to bust is melatonin. So let's talk a little bit about that. And it's probably the most misunderstood sleep supplement. And I've heard you specifically say that it's actually not a sleep aid. So can you explain what melatonin actually does?
Yeah, great questions. And I will say it's still very layered, and we still, I believe, need more research because there's
Yeah.
really strong camps. In I would say really three camps that I could point to quickly, which is one, the no melatonin for you camp, or at least like an external
It's
melatonin.
always extremes, right? It's always this or that.
It's always extreme.
Yeah.
Totally. They're the loudest. So that camp is saying, listen, we should be able to make natural melatonin. Let's get to the root of it. What is going on with the prevalence, especially in the United States, of the ability to just buy melatonin willy-nilly, whereas in other
Mm,
countries you have to get prescriptions to get melatonin. It's regulated like a hormone because it is a hormone.
yeah.
And so that group is like, let's get to the source
Mm,
of why you're not, making this sufficiently. Then there's kind of the medium tier where it says taking low dose melatonin and the positive effects that that may have for sleep.
mm,
Certainly, I will say this group is often pointing to benefits for jet lag,
yeah.
which we do appear to have some clear benefits by utilizing melatonin when you are dealing with jet lag
Yeah.
for kind of shortened periods of time.
Mm,
And apps like Time Shifter, actually just got off the phone with one of the heads of Time Shifter app, which I highly recommend if anyone's going to be traveling, long haul travel. Get that app for sure. Very helpful. And they also just released something called the Shift Work app. And
mm,
this is leveraging melatonin strategically in more maybe extreme cases like that,
yeah.
or cases that are a little bit more out of the norm than the regular 9 to 5 person that's staying put.
Yeah.
So melatonin strategically in those cases. And then I would say there's another group that looks at high dose melatonin, and high dose melatonin for things like cancers, high viral load. It became more in vogue during the pandemic. And so people
Wow.
would talk about utilizing high dose melatonin when dealing with COVID, et cetera. So
Mm-hmm.
different groups. Now, what I would say is, since I am really of the estimation that so much of what our problem is with our sleep is that we've gone indoors. So what do I mean by that is that the average, since the EPA did a study in 2001 and found that the average person is spending around 90% of their time indoors. And that was in 2001, before real, smartphones and work from home revolution and Netflix and all these things that have brought us even more indoors. So I would say that it's probably even higher than that. So from that whole perspective, I think it's important for us to understand that part of the problem is that we have divorced ourselves from these rhythms of nature, and melatonin. This is an important piece. Melatonin, one of our newer discoveries in recent years, is the knowledge that melatonin isn't just created from the brain, which we used to think of just this brain based melatonin, but also from our mitochondria. I keep talking about mitochondria, but like, why am I talking about mitochondria so much? Because it's so important for your sleep. But also, you're making 95% of your subcellular melatonin by virtue of sunlight and by being outside. That's partly why we're saying you got to get yourself outside. We had one of our most listened to podcasts was with Dr. Sachin Panda out of the Salk Institute, and decades of research. And one of the things that he's found in alignment with meal timing and its impact on sleep, but also he has found that you need, at least in his lab and some of his findings, that you need at least about an hour outside every day to make sufficient melatonin at night, which can be confusing because you would think of melatonin as the hormone of darkness or the vampire hormone, which it is those things, because you do need the presence of darkness to create melatonin at night. But the flip side and the kind of law of polarity is that then you need that bright light to make it at night. So So this is where I'd have most people begin, because so many people are like, oh yeah, I get outside, whatever. Most people are dealing with circadian derangement, is what we call it. So circadian
It's like a
derangement.
cause and
Uh,
effect.
yeah, exactly. And listen, I mean, I just moved from downtown Austin to this house, and it's made such a difference for me to be able to more easily have access to indoor outdoor lifestyle, and to
Yeah.
really live my brand and live what I, speak about all the time. So that's been
Yeah.
so important for me, because, I'd have to work so much harder in a, apartment building and get into the stinking
Yeah.
elevator to go outside and get grounded and so all that to say that our lifestyle choices impact our results, but particularly with melatonin. Now, the other piece is that because so many of us are having such variability in our sleep wake schedule, your melatonin pulse that happens at night, if you are moving around your sleep wake schedule, this is why one of the next things I would ask for people to start testing out if they're struggling with their sleep is to start anchoring their wake up time in particular. And I say wake up time intentionally because if you start, say, whatever it is, say you want to start waking up at 7 a.m., we want you to waking up at around 7 a.m. every single day, 7 days a week, plus or minus around 30 minutes. You can swing it a little bit. But for the most part, you're anchored in at that consistent wake up time. What does that do? Well, this impacts melatonin at night, ironically, because now you're going to have a set time for your cortisol pulse. So this pulse in the morning, because you want that. It's, even though it gets like a bad rap, you need cortisol. It's so important, and it's like natural coffee, gets you up, gets you moving, gets everything, the bowels and all kinds of stuff going. And so you want to have that natural cortisol pulse in the morning, but then reliably, 16 hours later or so, then what starts to happen is then this reliable melatonin pulse. And so this reliable melatonin pulse can be surging at the right times if you've trained those two poles on the start and end of your day. But if you haven't, and if you're someone that most people are dealing with social jet lag, where they sleep in on the weekends,
Hmm.
so they don't get on a plane and it didn't go anywhere, but they have all of the symptomology of jet lag. So for those people, and that's most of us, they have that variability in their sleep wake schedule. So now the body doesn't know, when does it pulse its cortisol, when
Right.
does it pulse its
Yeah.
melatonin. So what I would suggest is people begin with these things, and that's not the extensive part of it. So I just allude, I know, well, it's like these things are so there's so much to discuss about these things. So just
Hmm.
I'll allude for people to check out the fact that we've talked about light dark, and that will massively impact your melatonin production. Temperature timing will also really impact your melatonin production. So supporting that you're getting a higher amplitude of temperature by day, and then helping to support it markedly dropping into the night. That will support your
What are
melatonin.
some ideal temperatures?
Yeah, so for the night, you want to be sleeping in closer to 60 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's out of the Sleep Foundation. So
Wow.
that's much cooler than most people are doing.
Yeah.
And that can actually help support brown fat, which is very mitochondrial dense. You see a theme with this mitochondrial
Mm.
thing. And so mitochondrial dense brown fat can has been reported to emerge when you're in these cooler temperatures. That's where cooling mattress toppers can be really helpful. We are sponsored
Mm.
by 8 Sleep. I will call that out. But also there's 8 Sleep, there's Chili Sleep, and Sleep Number, different things that you can get cooling mattress toppers. And that could sound so like exotic, but it's actually, you could argue that that's closer to how we likely used to sleep, which would be on the ground. And on the ground would be part
Mm.
of the coolest part in our environment. So we're kind of mimicking
Right.
closer to that than these like man-made duvets and foam
Wow.
mattresses and all that stuff, where we trap
Yeah.
our heat in there and kind of cook like rotisserie chicken all night long. So with that, that's a melatonin piece. So having that clear drop in body temperature helps support melatonin production. That's another reason why you could leverage things like cold therapy by day, heat therapy by night, to oddly have a paradoxical effect, because heat therapy then results in cooling of the body. So you could layer that in at night, and then so that's there's light timing, temperature timing, meal timing is also massively going to impact your melatonin production. So what I mean by that is also with Dr. Sachin Panda, that episode is really chock full of interesting things, and he speaks to when your pancreas Yeah, great. Yeah, when your pancreas is turned on by virtue of eating, even if it's healthy stuff or it doesn't matter. If you are turning on your pancreas at night when the sun has set, then it's impacting the body's ability to make sufficient melatonin. So you really want to have sufficient time before bed where you're stopping eating your last bite of food. Now, the conservative call out is between 2 to 3 hours, but I would say now we need more research, et cetera. But I would say anecdotally, what we're seeing on the ground with wearable data is that when you have your last bite of food closer to 4 to 5 hours or more before bed, that we see lots of improvements in things like deep sleep, heart rate, HRV. You can put a continuous glucose monitor on to check these things. There's a lot there. So that would be meal timing, meal type, then getting into exercise timing, making sure you're having your exercise at least around 4 hours before bed, but in some accounts, even looking at around 6 hours before bed, but aiming to support the types of workouts that you're having, certainly not the high intensity before bed, obviously. Then thought timing. So if you're all stressed out, so cortisol rising at the wrong time can impair your ability to make melatonin. So that would be thought timing, and that's a whole world in and of itself of how we're managing our stress and our thoughts and the timing and creating boundaries and having enough runway to down regulate in the evening, especially like entrepreneurs or people that can make their own hours. Like, I get it. And then lastly, chronopharmacology, or the timing of our drugs. So certain drugs can impair our ability to make sufficient melatonin. So, and the most common obviously being like caffeine, alcohol, THC, nicotine, supplements, prescription drugs, etc. Even now, plant medicines and things that are more in vogue. All of these things can throw off their circadian cycling. So that gives you a little bit of a primer of all of the things that are common that could be impacting your melatonin production. But then, I mean, we're not even touching on some of these other things that could be at play with why you might not be sleeping as well as you might like to be. You know, stealth infections, molds, humidity levels, air quality, dealing with different things that might be going on in the body. So heavy metals, right? Yeah, microtoxins, etc. So there's a whole world that can be explored when you're not sleeping. But I would say that first, interestingly enough, things like the simplicity of getting outside and getting sunlight on your skin and in your eyes, where most people are having, their sunglasses on, their sunscreen, and da 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 da, which I get it. I used to do all those things and more. Like meeting, like that was just covered all the time indoors. I did
Yeah.
everything the opposite of what I'm talking about now. That by virtue of doing those things, our body can have natural healing processes that can be enacted too. So I don't want people to be left with like,
Mm.
well, what I would have to get a million tests and like what have a whole supplement protocol or something. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that often when we start with those what could feel like basics or soft skills, those can be the whole story, especially if we're dealing with what's known as cell danger response, where the body is now in kind of this chronic emergency stressed state.
Yeah.
Then getting those safety signals of sunlight, grounding, nature, all of those things, it's not just a nice to have, but it can actually fundamentally shift the workability of your biology. And we are biologically hardwired to be aligned with those rhythms of nature. So, all that to say that while this can land as like a complicated thing, it's like, does it have to be so complicated to sleep? The biggest takeaway is that we want to mimic what's happening outside inside and get ourselves outside as much as we possibly can. So um, I would just implore the listener, if they're struggling with their sleep, if they feel like they've tried everything, that sometimes the answer is almost so simple it's been missed. And I will also point to, from a history perspective of sleep in general as an area of study, a really cool book is called Mapping the Darkness, and it's fairly new. But one of the things that that book points to is that sleep as a domain really didn't come into vogue until the Industrial Revolution. And with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, when we went indoors under electric lights, that's when we started seeing all these sleep issues crop up. So, it can sound so almost just like cliche, oh, avoid your blue light at night. Instead, it's really, really, it takes something to live this sort of circadian aligned lifestyle that might look a little weird. Like, for
Yeah.
instance, my husband had a game night the other night, and they were all trying to play, and they're like, we can't see anything. Like, why is your place so dark? I just, so you have to kind of make these, like, weird shifts in your
Adjustments.
behavior.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. But your
Yeah.
health and your health and your biology and your psychology will all benefit.
Yes, absolutely. And you talk about mitochondria so much, and we learned this in biology. It is the powerhouse of our cell. And I think we just have to really tune into our bodies. And honestly, post pandemic, I think we've been seeing a lot more sleep issues, right? We're living through what experts are calling a sleep crisis. And so especially in like recent years, past 3 to 4 years, there's so much research, right, that shows, specifically Gen Z, 40% of Gen Zs experience sleep anxiety. And then there's all this social media. There's just so many influences, that hustle culture, that we have to just work hard, or we have to stay up so we can achieve more. And I think that sometimes the best way to make sure that our bodies are sustainable, because at the end of the day, if we're not functioning optimally, we can't achieve all of that. And for that sustenance, I think it's really important to sometimes, even if it takes maybe an extra week to achieve whatever it is that someone's trying to do, it's okay, because at the end of the day, the body is the vehicle to get to the destination. And this episode has been truly eye-opening. And I think we have to do a part two, because this has already been a masterclass, and there's so many other things that, I really want to talk about. But maybe we could end with this. We've covered a lot. And I know quantum biology is a topic that's very close to you. Can you share a little bit about what exactly is quantum biology, and how does that help our core sleep? And leave us with some guidance on how our audience can actually adopt that and take it a step further.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from a quantum, defining quantum biology, when you think of quantum, it's kind of this very, very small aspect of things, right? So, on the most
Yeah.
simplest of ways to describe, when we think about how something so small could impact our biology. So, what are
Right.
the smallest aspects? So, one, that's where some of this focus on mitochondrial health comes in. It's just this teeny tiny aspect of our health and well being, including other, and it gets more of a rabbit hole, but at least just focusing for now on the mitochondria. And so, how could this small little aspect of our health be making such an impact in our entire workability of our biology and psychology? And how could it be charged by something so basic as the sun? And so, often for people that are looking into quantum biology and just having like a visual or visceral experience as to why this would be so impactful for human beings. Some of the analogies are often like taking a plant and then putting a tarp over top of the plant and asking yourself, how well do you think this thing is going to thrive and flourish? Obviously, for all of us, we know photosynthesis, et cetera, that it's not going to do so hot because it is charged and powered by the sun. And yet we think that we're so different. And it turns out that from a quantum biology perspective, when you look at just the sheer hitting of the light, so this is like using photobiomodulation as a real kind of medical pathway for health, then the hitting of sun onto your skin and into your eyes, and how that can help charge this mitochondria, and how this is part and parcel. So, light, water, magnetism are some of the aspects of quantum biology and helping and supporting your health. And those are things that NASA uses to ascertain if a planet can sustain life, is the levels of light, water, and magnetism. And so we again have just forgot all of this. And so quantum biology helps us bring us back to this. And That will also leverage things like chronobiology, which is the science of time and how time affects our biology. So it's not just regulates just circadian rhythm. I know I've talked a lot about circadian rhythm, which is a 24-hour rhythm, around 24 hours, and yet your infradian rhythm. So this is important for women, especially. So that's rhythms that last longer than a day, like our menstrual cycle, like the moon cycle, the lunar cycle, etc. Those are examples of infradian rhythm. There's other rhythms from our seasons. There's rhythms that are less than a day, or ultradian rhythms. So there's all these rhythms and those are all kind of encapsulated within the world of chronobiology. And quantum biology really looks at that and how we can leverage that knowledge to support overall well-being. So there is, that's on the most simplistic side of things, but hopefully that can help spark some, as they might say, like rocks to look under for people to start exploring more. Yeah, love it. Good. Well, thank you so much for saying that and for creating a platform to share about these topics. I truly believe that I dodged a bullet because I also saw, close to me on a personal level, seeing very close family members go down the path, unfortunately, of heavy duty pharmaceuticals and really missing out on a whole period of their lives as a result of not getting more up to date information and this education. So for me, it's like on a mission to share this because it doesn't have to go that way. So appreciate the
Absolutely.
time and attention on it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. This has been truly a masterclass. And I can't wait for the audience to take, listen and see a transformation. So thank you so much, Molly.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Be minimally processed.